that story, she begins to talk about Joseph, and she says the words. And by the way, I had invited them up from D.C., where they live in Alexandria, and our family, we're big fans of musicals, and The Wiz was playing at City Center. Ashanti was Dorothy, and Orlando Malone was The Wiz. Yeah, it was, ran for a couple of weeks. But, so they came up, and it was a great show. We're at a coffee house, and my mother's telling me she's divulging all this information that I had never really asked about. Because, as far as I was concerned, I had a fantastic family, fantastic mother, so life was good. But she says the words, Milton, do you know that your brother Joseph was abandoned? I'm thinking, all right, well, me and Joe, we were in the orphanage together, so we were orphans. And orphan, I think part of that definition is orphans are abandoned. So, yeah, Mom, yeah, he was abandoned, just like I was. She goes, no, there was more to that. And as my father is outside, kind of people watching, just like what I love to do, my mother begins to tell me the story about what happened to Joseph, or Joseph B. She says that when Joseph was 5, living out in the countryside, just like I did with my mother, clay hut, thatch roof, no cars, no electricity, rice fields as far as the eyes can see, that him living with his mother, being black and Korean and having a Korean mother, part of my story and part of our story is about the racism of Korea that we experience. But for me, I was good with the racism because I always had my mother to come home to and had the safety of my mother's arms and my mother's words and my mother's love. But Joseph, the safety of his mother disappeared because she ended up marrying a Korean man that abused him. And I remember after we were adopted, being that we're the only 2 people in the household of a black couple from Texas and with 4 natural kids. By the way, their names Don, Donna, Darren, and Dwayne. Yeah, that's how black folks do it. I got a feeling some of y'all Korean folks do that too. I don't know that for a fact. That's gonna be the next book. I'm gonna search. I got a chapter called Church and Chicken, and it says that black folks and Koreans are a lot more alike than different. I'm gonna prove that point. Y'all love some church, and we do too. But he was abused by this man that ended up marrying his mother. And I remember after we were adopted, he used to tell me this. And he used to say that he used to run away at the age of 5. How do you run away at 5? But his village had 2 roads, one going that way and one going this way. And this man would always find him. And when he did, he would abuse him. Until his mother got in the way and the abuse stopped, or at least that kind of abuse stopped. And I remember Joe telling me that this man would make him stand on his head for hours at a time. I'm not a doctor, but I'm like, standing on your head at the age of 5 for hours at a time, that can't be good for you. So I remember him telling me that. And then, back in the coffee shop, as my mother told me that, this situation, it rang true to me. Yeah, I got it. But she goes on to tell me how a family from Yongsan, where my parents were stationed, they had wanted to adopt a Korean boy, a mixed Korean boy, an Amerasian. And Father King had hooked it up in which Joseph was adopted by this family. He gets adopted by this family, lives with the family for several months, and the family is now getting ready to go back overseas, and they're living in temporary housing, and one night they go to sleep, and right before the day they're getting ready to leave, Joseph wakes up to an empty house. The family had left the boy, and they say they left the boy because he had too many emotional issues. So Father King swings back in, takes Joseph back to his mother. But now Joseph goes back to, the abusive situation that he was in before. And his mother sends a letter to Joseph's biological father because Joseph is 5 years old. The Korean man is not having it. And something I think happened in the story that doesn't happen in my stories very much, or our stories very much. That letter gets routed through the army, and it lands in the hands of Joseph's biological father, who just so happens to be serving another tour in South Korea at the time. And we're going to call him Sergeant Lewis for the sake of the story. Sergeant Lewis gets a letter saying, hey, you got to come and get your son. And then Sergeant Lewis agrees to do something that doesn't happen in my stories with Amerasian kids. It doesn't happen. He agrees to do so. Oh, by the way, and I remember right after my mother told me that, my father comes in and says, Gwen, what are you doing telling Milton that story? And my mother's like, Don, that was the Seagresses that adopted Joseph, and we can tell that story. He said, no, Milton is writing a book. You can't tell that story because we weren't there, and we can't validate that story. Yeah, because I'm going to tell the story. I'm telling it right now. Damn right. So, but he sits down and says, we can tell you this story. We can't tell you that one, we can tell you this one. So that story is that letter being routed to his father finding out, coming to get his father from his mother, picking him up. And I remember after being adopted, Joe never told me that he lived with his father, ever. Because I told him, I never knew my father. I just dreamed of him being in America, some crazy land with cities of gold that floated in the clouds and flying cars and gold streets and mountains made out of ice cream. That's what I thought America was. So Joseph's father, Sergeant Lewis, picks Joe up, takes him, and has his son living in an apartment with him off the military base. Joseph's learning Korean. Sergeant Lewis is falling in love with his son, and he decides, I'm going to take my son back home, overseas. My tour is about to end. But the State Department says before you take him back overseas, you have to adopt your son. Okay, starts the adoption process. But one of the things about adoption process and kids like us, being born black in Korea, we don't have any papers. We don't have birth certificates. We don't have papers. So I was never a Korean citizen, even though I was on first language, my first culture, everything. So they try to do everything. They try to change his name. They try to change everything. They made him a new dude. Didn't work. So long story short, that adoption process lasts an entire year. Long time. So then, the end of Sergeant Lewis's tour, he says, something, I'm going to take Joseph back, but the State Department gives him special permission to take him back overseas. So he gets his son with a pending adoption and takes him to Kim Po International Airport, take him back home. As the plane is boarding, Sergeant Lewis says, Joseph, hang on just a second, I'll be right back. I'm going to go use the restroom. Goes use the restroom, never comes back. Joseph runs to the bathroom looking for his father. And what his father had done was snuck on the plane and got on that flight to America and never came back. So then Father King, of course, has to come back to Kim Po International Airport, pick him up, and that's when Joseph starts his 3-year stint at Father King's house. 2 years into Father King's house is when Joseph sees a van full of American women pile out. And one of those women was a black woman. Big afro. You know how they do in the 70s. It's like 70s. But that black woman was Gwen Washington. She was the wife of Captain Donnell Washington. She was the only black person in that officers' wives club because her husband was Captain Donnell Washington, one of the few black officers in Asia in the 70s for the Army. And part of what the Officers' Wives Club, they do is they go around and they do volunteer missions all throughout Korea. And while Gwen is at Father King's house, she's feeling some kind of way about all these little black kids and mixed white kids. And she comes home one day after working with the kids and says, Don, they're probably laying in bed. That's what a real conversation happens. So Don, what do you think about adopting one of these kids? And Don Washington's like, wait, we got 4 kids. And I'm a captain. I'm down here on the totem pole, you know? So we're good. But you know, we all know who holds the real power. So after a while, you know, yeah, he kind of gives in. And she says, I want that kid right there, Joseph, the saddest one in the place. So they begin the adoption process on Joseph. 1 week later, 2 weeks later, 5 weeks later, 3 months later, still doesn't go through. And they do everything to change that little boy's name and nationality, all kind of other things. Still doesn't happen. It doesn't happen because he's being adopted by somebody else. His father, who never completed the adoption before, left him at Kimpo. So they do everything for an entire year. And then, at the end of Joseph's 3rd year, Father King gives Don Washington, Captain Don Washington, a call while he's sitting in his office. And Father King, if you guys don't know, he spent most of his time on Capitol Hill fighting for the rights of Amerasians, saying that we should have priority access back to the states because these are our kids. That's what he did. He died just a few years ago, and God bless him. And Father King was slick. He knew every trick in the book. So he calls Don Washington, hey, Don, how you doing? They shoot the shit, blah, 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 whatever. Yeah, Don, I understand that you got 2 new sergeants starting, reporting to you next Monday. Don Washington goes, yeah, Sergeant Johnson, Sergeant Lewis. That Sergeant Lewis is our Sergeant Lewis. Don Washington's like, really? Who's this one? Okay, click, fast forward to next Monday. So now Don Washington is briefing the 2 sergeants, brand new sergeants that's reporting to him on the new job. And after the briefing, yeah, Sergeant Johnson, can you excuse Sergeant Lewis and I? We need to talk. So, Sergeant Lewis, it's come to my attention that several years ago you fathered a child here in South Korea. Is that correct? Yes, sir. Okay. It's also come to my attention that several years ago, about 3 years ago, you abandoned that child at Kimpo International Airport. Is that correct? Yes, sir. Well, why'd you do it? Sir, my son was living with his mother in an abusive situation at home. A Korean man that was beating him up. She asked me to come and pick him up, and I did so. Props to you. And then I fell in love with my son, and I wanted to take him home. Took him to the airport, getting ready to get on the plane, and at the last minute I got cold feet. Because my 3 kids at home and my wife knew nothing about them. And I felt that as strained as my relationship was already with my wife, I felt that I was going to lose everybody.